Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our third presentation with Faizan Malik, titled COVID-19, Necropolitics, and Marginalized Experiences During a Global Pandemic. Faizan is pursuing a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science at the University of Toronto. Just a friendly reminder before we begin to leave all comments and questions in the comment box on Teachable and/or on YouTube. And we'll be posing your questions to the panel during the live Q&A following our last presentation. Thank you. The floor is all yours, Faizan.
This presentation is called COVID-19 Necropolitics and Marginalized Experiences. So specifically what I'm focusing on is a contrast between a necropolitical kind of structuring of the response to the pandemic and one that's based on a specific kind of scientific narrative. So just to give a kind of brief outline of what I mean by necropolitical, so there's a kind of shift from the Foucauldian notion of biopolitical power, which is power over life, to Achille Mbembe's notion of the necropolitical, which is specifically, as opposed simply to the ability to govern who is fit for living in the Foucauldian sense, but also who is fit for dying. So specific policies that states can undertake to expose certain populations to death or expose certain populations to certain forms of violence. So again, there's a contrast that I want to create between the notion of a kind of scientific response to the pandemic, which I think is perhaps not the best way to go about it, any kind of critical or necropolitical response. And that's because science is functioning now, it seems, as the new basis of a kind of technocratic legitimacy, which is that since most responses to COVID-19 are being structured under the guise of like, listen to the science, this is what you see in the media and the kind of, public sphere. The danger here is not that the science is false or inaccurate. Rather, the problem is that the science is almost too correct, it's too accurate in some sense, and it can be used effectively as a form of technocratic legitimacy. So for example, Boris Johnson here, he had one of the kind of earliest ideas that we should build herd immunity in the UK, that when a majority of people in the country get COVID-19, will build kind of generalized resiliency. And even though there was a kind of backlash in the media, the scientific community did come out to say that, well, there is some kind of general credence to this idea. But I think that's where the problem lies, that essentially, if this herd immunity had been implemented through a form of scientific rationality, what would have happened is that the amount of people that are necessary to die in the herd immunity kind of rationale would have been people without access to healthcare, people without access to social services, people just generally in the lower income strata of society. And obviously, this would have been disproportionately people in marginalized groups. So there's a way in which science cannot provide the answer for very legitimate social crises that take place, in the sense that if we do implement some sort of scientific rationale, how is this actually going to affect the process of marginalized experiences? Are they actually going to somehow come out worse off? And this is what I mean by conflicting narratives of technocratic legitimacy. So at the same time that in the United States, for example, we have massive riots for Black Lives Matter, massive riots for racial justice and equality, we see rationalizations from the kind of technocratic state that, this person was reaching for a gun, or, they have past crime histories, et cetera, et cetera. A variety of excuses are made that we just can't accept in terms of why this kind of violence is being enacted. And yet what happened in COVID-19, strangely enough, is that this idea of scientific legitimacy, scientific expertise, has actually been used to recreate a sense of technocratic legitimacy in the state. That the same state we had just undermined as a kind of, arbiter of police violence, for example, we now have to rely on that same exact state as a kind of, bureaucratic expert in terms of what the science is, how we're going to be implementing the science. So again, the point isn't that we shouldn't be listening to scientific measures. Absolutely, we should be. But rather, the point is, should we structure our response primarily as scientific? Or, we should be more critical of how scientific responses can often bolster technocratic legitimacy for otherwise failed institutions. And there's also variation here across states where you don't even necessarily need to have a national kind of scientific program. So for example, in Brazil, unlike the UK, necropolitical administration takes the form of a non-scientific rationale, where Bolsonaro is saying that, I reject the science entirely, masks are not mandatory, no one needs to, you can medicate with bleach and things of this fashion. And so we see the very real reality of explicit state power instead, and how science is completely ineffective in countering this. So for example, indigenous Brazilians live on the specific form of kind of indigenous territories. Now, whether they follow the science or not, whether they're washing their hands, whether they're using hand sanitizer, this is not going to change the reality of state power, which is that Bolsonaro is already further encroaching on their land. He's kind of funding development projects into the Brazilian Amazon. So common to both cases, both in the UK and Brazil, scientific rationale, non-scientific rationale, is that following the science only works as an effective strategy for specific members of the population dictated through necropolitical administration. So if you're one of the populations that can be kind of effectively exposed to death by state policies, such as marginalized communities, such as indigenous communities in Brazil, you are not actually going to be able to use science as a structuring kind of narrative to protect yourself. And ironically, kind of subsidiary ideology of science can also be used. So for example, Bolsonaro openly rejects scientific expertise, but then he uses a form of scientific racism to justify policies that harm indigenous communities. He says things like, oh, they're unhygienic, they're evolutionarily underdeveloped. So he's not willing to not use science. He's only willing to use science in a way to kind of harm indigenous communities through kind of specific violent language. Science is also a depoliticizing mechanism. That's why I put this fellow here from the World Health Organization. He said, don't politicize COVID-19. But really, the flexibility to not politicize COVID-19 is, again, it's a function of the political. So some of the earliest Brazilian cases of COVID-19 occurred when wealthy families that were vacationing Paris, Milan, they came home, they went to their domestic care workers. They didn't notify them that, hey, I'm actually sick. I've tested positive for COVID-19 in some case. They didn't even tell them. And these domestic care workers actually ended up dying. So in that sense, even two people who are following the science equivalently, let's say they're both doing everything they need to do, hand sanitizer, washing their hands, wearing masks, we can see how they can actually, or their death is differentiated by the fact that who has access to medical care, who has access to social services, who has employment flexibility. So many marginalized communities don't have the flexibility to view COVID-19 as non-political. Specifically in Brazil, for example, in the favelas, like certain gangs essentially have to be the ones that are administering kind of, hand sanitizer and social services because the state is not willing to do so. So they don't have the flexibility to view COVID-19 as non-political. For them, it's entirely political. It's a question of class, gender, race, etc., etc. And equally, what COVID-19 is creating here is a form of specific technocratic governmentality. So the specific implementation of scientific measures, it bolsters obviously the ability of states, as we discussed, to engage in necropolitical administration. But it equally creates new manifestations of kind of state power, which individualizes moral responsibility. So you have to be essentially consensually and voluntarily responsible for doing things like, wearing a mask, washing your hands, hand sanitizer, especially in Western states, which were kind of more lax in terms of their early COVID policy, in terms of making these things mandatory. So in that sense, we create a kind of moral culture in terms of who's following regulations and who's not following regulations. So populations who are unable to uphold these measures, such as homeless people, for example, they're now forced to kind of consensually agree to certain state measures, such as being forced into squatter camps, tightly packed warehouses. And obviously, it's not really consensual in the sense that if they're not going to agree to this, they'll be part of that moral scapegoat. They'll be part of that new culture of governmentality, which is that if you're not upholding these different things, like, washing your hands, all these different state kind of procedures that you have to uphold, you can be kind of the victim of a form of righteous violence. So for example, we noticed in Toronto specifically, where Doug Ford, he has been kind of he's been increasing the privatization of long-term care homes. And then anytime if you try to kind of criticize this medical administration or a larger kind of economic context, for example, you'll be kind of responded to with the idea that, well, people are not following the science, people are not washing their hands, et cetera, et cetera. So science actually becomes a depoliticizing force, and it becomes the structure of a new technocratic governmentality, which some populations entirely are not able to engage in. For example, homeless populations. Recently, I saw on the news a very upsetting story about a woman who had a specific mental illness. She was not able to engage in these kind of COVID procedures to the same extent. Things like, washing your hands, wearing masks, she was not able to do them to the same extent. And so by creating these moral cultures of governmentality in which if you're not kind of upholding, often voluntarily and consensually, these obligations, then you can be the victim of a kind of, backlash by the state, even a backlash by citizens. And so again, these are all being legitimated by the science. The science is creating a kind of individualization of COVID-19. Next, the state of exception going forward. So Agamben bases his idea of the state of exception on a kind of particular reading of Carl Schmitt's critique of political economy, even one could say. So for him, liberal politics tries to, and by liberal, he means kind of parliamentary democratic politics. And he's writing in 1930s at the end, to be fair, he was a member of the Nazi party, which is obviously why he would say something like this and criticize liberal politics. But his essential point was that liberal politics assumes the death of the sovereign, that the sovereign power, like the traditional monarch has completely died. They no longer exist. Now we have parliament, we have rule of law, etc., etc. But Membe and Agamben both recreate the sense of sovereignty with Carl Schmitt's notion of the state of exception, which is that anytime the sovereign wants, they can actually just completely disregard every single rule that exists, parliamentary democracy, all of these things can be completely removed. And the state is still the sovereign. So for example, 9/11 in 9/11, after 9/11, the privacy kind of massive surveillance state came into place, massive invasion of privacy, the creation of the TSA. And these are things that were supposed to exist for a limited period of time. They were supposed to exist as a kind of state of exception that, okay, there's a problem of terrorism, we're implementing these new policies. Now it's been 20 years, and it doesn't seem that this state of exception is ever going to end. So even though we had supposed kind of freedoms of privacy and freedom of thought and association, the sovereign, the state, is able to implement a kind of arbitrary state of exception and just say, no, due to some, emergency, state of emergency, now we have to forego all these rights. No longer any right to privacy, no longer any right to freedom of association. We're going to be monitoring your phone calls, etc., etc. So that's the best example. But crucial here is that this form of historical sovereignty is much different than today's contemporary sovereignty, obviously, because in historical sovereignty, as Foucault mentions, any form of death would have to be justified by reference to the sovereign. That if you killed someone, it would have to be that, oh, I killed them for the king or the queen. Today, if you kill someone, death has to be kind of justified in regards to the larger social body. And what COVID-19 is doing is providing specific opportunities for a state of exception, a necropolitical administration that is going to be using features of COVID-19 regulation and risk as a cover for a kind of indefinite policy. So for example, again, Brazil, Bolsonaro has prevented indigenous Brazilians from accessing medical care outside of indigenous territories. And he's citing medical concerns. He's saying that, they have diseases, they're being unhygienic, et cetera, et cetera. A variety of justifications and rationalizations are being made. But what really is taking place here is the state of exception that hypothetically never has to end. Because at what point would these policies be removed, essentially? Let's say that, 2 years from now, COVID-19 is gone. It'll still be difficult to get vaccines to the indigenous population in Brazil. Even if we got them vaccines, justifications could be made that, okay, well, now we understand how dangerous global pandemics can be. So going forward, we have a new set of policies to prevent certain populations from being able to be kind of, harbingers of disease during a kind of pandemic. So obviously you can notice the kind of, certain racial, ethnic, class-based undertones in terms of how these policies are going to be created and implemented. And this is what I mean by state of exception, that what the state can do is create a series of necropolitical administrative policies, which using the state of emergency and the idea of the pandemic, the idea of, COVID-19 going on forever, they can use these to indefinitely kind of pursue these policies for as long as they want. Similar to the 9/11 kind of breaches of privacy, which we still see continuing today. I don't think it's kind of outside of the imagination that even 20 years from now we can have specific kind of pandemic centric policies that to prevent another global pandemic, such and such populations need to be restricted in some fashion. And obviously this kind of implies another sense of state violence and kind of state coercion in that sense. So yes, in terms of concluding thoughts, it's not the purpose of this presentation to say that COVID-19 regulation is necessarily wrong or that following the scientific procedures is wrong. These scientific procedures, obviously they exist for a reason, they help people, but our primary response to COVID-19 should not be based on this notion of science because, science can serve as a basis for technocratic legitimation where even though we've successfully kind of, had a massive protest movement, now we're actually restructuring the legitimation of the state. We're restructuring technocracy. We're restructuring kind of, bureaucratic experts. It can bolster necropolitical administration, and it most importantly depoliticizes the social, political, and economic realities of the COVID-19 pandemic because COVID-19 is not a scientific problem. As much as it is a social problem, for example. And that's why in countries like the United States, when you see responses saying, oh, we need to wear masks, we need to wash our hands from people like, Biden, for example, right? Obviously, Trump was saying things almost akin to don't wear a mask, but the response has not been much better. This kind of, science-friendly approach that the Biden administration is taking that we need to, focus on science because that's not focusing on the medical administration. It's not focusing on why certain groups are more likely to, be infected with COVID-19, often based on racial, class, gender lines. So again, these entire social realities are obscured by looking at this kind of scientific absolutism. It's depoliticizing and it reconstructs legitimacies for the state. So instead, we should maintain a kind of critical acceptance, sure, of scientific procedures, but as one of the many narratives that we're using to address the consequences of COVID-19 going forward. And we should also continue to be critical of the ways that these narratives of scientific legitimacy diplomacy affect us as citizens, subjects, and communities, especially in areas in the global south in which necropolitical administration could continue for the foreseeable future, specifically against indigenous groups and vulnerable populations in that fashion. So that was the presentation. Thank you guys so much for listening, and that was the end of it.
Thank you, Faizan.
That's excellent. So just in terms of logistics, we're going to move on to our next speaker. So Faizan, if you could stop sharing your screen. Excellent. And Mufassir, I would like to invite you to share your screen for us.
Is it okay?
Thank you so much. So you are now live and you may begin whenever you are ready.
Okay. Thank you, co-chairs, and hello everyone. Hope you're doing well. I am Mohammad Mufassir Rashid from University of Dhaka, and my research title is Corona Effect on South Asian Politics, Diminishing Geopolitics and the Inception of Geoeconomics. This research is highly qualitative in nature and is based on secondary literature only. Geography has always played an obtrusive role in South Asian politics, whether it is India or Bangladesh or any other surrounding states. The complex demarcated areas left by the British Empire had been making rooms for geographical objective to gain economic and political imperatives. But since the 2008 financial crisis, the equation has started to change, and states have started to change their strategies also to achieve political and economic imperatives. States were on the path of recovering from financial crisis at this moment, and where the rise of China also played an important role. But COVID-19 has halted and added a new dimension to this crisis that compels the states to address economic security as national security. As a result, the discourse is also shifting from geopolitics to geoeconomics. This research is an attempt to understand the scenario and predict the future of South Asian politics using geoeconomics as the framework. The objective of this research is to theorize geoeconomics to understand its relevance in COVID-19 and post-COVID-19 era South Asian regional politics, and also to understand the shift in the foreign policy imperatives of South Asian states from geopolitics to geoeconomics due to COVID-19. In order to do so, this research will ask two questions. First, what are the effects of COVID-19 pandemic on South Asian states, and how corona effect is shaping policy objectives for South Asian states in terms of geopolitics and geoeconomics? Though geopolitics need no introduction, I would like to clear that our understanding of geopolitics is highly military-centric. In conventional wisdom, geopolitics is the study of power and politics in terms of geography. According to Tuathail, geopolitics is a discourse about world politics with emphasis on state competition and geographical dimension of power. In the empirical field, geopolitics is the influence of geographical factors such as population, terrain, location, climate, etc. on power politics, and in return, power politics balancing geographical factors for the interest of states. Geopolitics focuses highly on military power and had its glorious days in Cold War era politics, as military power is very important at that time for all the parties. According to Edward Luttwak, logic of conflict was zero-sum between the parties, which means from Luttwak's identifying geopolitics logic of conflict as zero-sum, it becomes hard to resonate with complex interdependence. After the end of Cold War, with liberalism on triumphant march, globalization and free market economy made the world more complex in terms of interdependence. In the age of economic liberalism, the importance of military power was gradually diminishing, and the method of commerce is displacing military method with capital in lieu of firepower and market penetration in lieu of bases. In such context, in 1990, Edward Luttwak introduced geoeconomics as a neologism. Geoeconomics is the use of economic tool to advance geopolitical objective of a state. Geoeconomics is the geostrategic use of economic power. In the Empirical field, geoeconomics is the use of aid politics, sanctions, monetary policy in energy sector, commodity market, etc. Two relevant factors gave rise to the geoeconomics, the rise of state capitalism and the state-owned enterprises. Geoeconomics can be also understood by paraphrasing Clausewitz as war by commercial means. Geoeconomics now occupies a major part of security aspect of foreign policy at the current time, as even the Trump government now acknowledges the economic security as the national security. Practitioners also pointed out logically that BRI, Maritime Silk Route, AIIB, etc. are also reflections of Chinese geoeconomics. After 30 years of Luttwak's neologism, two broad traditions emerged, Luttwakian and non-Luttwakian. Luttwakian tradition identified decay of military power geopolitics as pervasive and addressed complex interdependence in the post-Cold War world. He distinguished geoeconomics from mercantilism based on modality, where, unlike geoeconomics, mercantilism is a subordinate modality. And Luttwak also emphasized on post-Cold War era politics. Political quarrels should be dealt with economic instruments. Luttwak also facilitated the roles of non-state actors such as MNC scientists, even individuals. In non-Luttwakian tradition, the scholars criticizes Luttwak actually for being too busy in distinguishing between geopolitics and geoeconomics. Rather, they developed coexistence. For them, in the empirical aspect, economic power and military power tends to influence each other in the quest of national interests. Later scholars also transcended geoeconomics beyond Luttwakian realism and connected geoeconomics with other theories of IR such as liberalism, constructivism, etc. They also acknowledge that geoeconomics has a limited scope and as it only deals with economic power politics from geographical and strategic viewpoint. Based on the scope, they also distance geoeconomics from international political economy. For them, geoeconomics allows states or blocks to create or expand by turning its economic power into military power in conflict situation. The relevance in regional politics. Geoeconomics is very relevant in regional politics as it serves as foreign policy strategy for the actors to practice power politics through economic means. Again, mobilizing economy also helps actors to create extra space in their regional politics. For instance, it also allows them to decrease their reliance on regional powerhouses for weaker states. For example, in many regions where states face dominant Chinese hegemony, they tend to create deep economic relation with USA to create US stake in regional politics. India's deepening its economic ties with US to counter Chinese investment is also another example of relevance of geoeconomics in regional politics. The South Asian politics. The South Asian states are mostly middle income and lower income states. India serves as a powerhouse in the regional politics. India also shares borders with almost every state. In last decade, increasing Chinese stake and the rise of China also became an important factor in this region. As a result, the overall politics now revolves around Sino-Indian rivalry, which is the great game in this regional politics. There are also presence of nuclear stake in this regional politics as China, India, Pakistan are nuclear states. With the rise of China, there are evidence of Chinese geoeconomics practices in the last 10 years, such as BRI, soft loan, aid politics, etc. Presence of nuclear power and 2008 financial crisis compelled other states to seek for economic policies to counter the powerhouses. As a result, states are utilizing their economic power in terms of geography to create their space in power politics. As most of the states do not have ambition for power projection, unlike India and China, their ultimate objective are to ensure socio-economic interest. As a result, in this region, business rather than basis is popular. Therefore, powerhouse like India is also practicing geoeconomics since the last decade to counter Chinese geoeconomic strategies such as Kaladan multimodal road and the neighbor first policy, etc. Alliance building is also highly economic at present. There are visible complex interdependence among the states. For instance, the Scindia thesis that shows the interdependence among the rivers, though not very popular, but still it is relevant as it shows the interdependence. Such interdependence compels both India and China to abandon militarism in the long term, though militarism is still relevant in this region in short term. The COVID-19 has brought a massive blow to the economies. Amidst the pandemic, we saw the crisis in Galwan Valley between China and India took place, and the Nepal-India dispute over Lipu Lake also took place amidst the pandemic. The pandemic scenario in South Asia. South Asian states lack in their health sector very badly. When the COVID-19 or coronavirus pandemic started, these countries, like most other states, followed the policy of lockdown and quarantine. As a result of month-long lockdown and quarantine, their economy took heavy toll. Again, due to outbreak and closing of borders, states that used to rely upon remittance, tourism, and exports is also facing heavy reduction in economic size. As a result, stagnation is visible all over the South Asian economy, and the recession is going on. According to experts at Hudson, the economic impact of COVID-19 on South Asia results in a decline of economy. According to Hassan and Ishizaki, GDP growth with India projected to post only 1.5 to 3% growth, Bangladesh to 2 to 3%, Nepal to 1.5 to 3%, and Sri Lanka negative 3%, and Pakistan negative 2%. The projection for 2021 is not also very encouraging. Again, before the pandemic, all of these states had heavy number of unemployment. And when the pandemic situation came, it also enlarged the number to a new height. For instance, in India, under lockdown, the employment rose to 23.4%, where in urban area, it is more than 30%. Other states are also suffering from the same fate. Hassan and Nishizaki's study also shows the poor health expenditure of South Asia, where it is only 3.5% of GDP, while the global standard is average 10.2%, which shows the very grim picture actually. In these states, many sectors are actually right now facing heavy crash due to the pandemic restrictions. Tourism in Nepal, for example, is now facing this collapse and due to no travel policy actually. And they need the help of UNDP to sustain this sector during this coronavirus. And right now UNDP is designing short-term employment for 5,000 people actually. And such realities suggest that for the South Asian states, battling and recovery from pandemic on their own is not possible. China's smart diplomacy, India's giving aid are also some cases that also fit such claim. And there are also events of aiding each other in this battling pandemic. For instance, Bangladesh aided assistance to Maldives, and we can also see the aid assistance and also discontents. For example, Maldives sent back 3,200 undocumented Bangladeshi workers amidst the pandemic. After the financial crisis in 2008, the emergence of economic security as prime foreign policy objective for smaller states in this region became visible. Ensuring economic security is ensuring national security, primarily as smaller states are hardly capable of doing so by military means. Alliance building is also being influenced by such policies. For instance, Nepal and Oli regimes siding with China, where China placed 500 million US dollar to Nepal. Before Oli regime, Nepal used to balance the powerhouses, but now in Nepal, China prevails. Such change in foreign policy direction of Nepal shows that the smaller countries of South Asia are actually gradually putting more economic gain as their imperative in their foreign policy. And the effect of corona pandemic is surely accelerating this process. Now, the word accelerating, I bolded it in my presentation because it is important to understand, because this research deals with corona effect and which is also identifies the effect as accelerating till now. The shift in policy imperatives in the last decade. The global financial crisis of 2008 created link between economy and security. After that, the tendency to adopt inward outlook became popular around the globe, and as an effect of it, economic nationalism became very popular. For instance, the Brexit took place. South Asian states mostly depend on exporting finished products and remittance. Because of such trend of inward outlook, the market was shrinking and their offering cheap labor and products was diminishing gradually. As a result, economic security became a prime objective for them. They accepted and appreciated Chinese investment in this context. Thus, they also started geoeconomics as their policy. Such policies also helped them in counterbalancing their regional powerhouses. As a result, geoeconomics was also visible there side by side with geopolitics as a spontaneous activity, which is a visible shift from policy imperative in this region. Now, let's come to the key finding of our research, which is the diminishing geopolitics and the inception of geoeconomics. Pandemic prolonged and revitalized the recession that took place by global financial crisis and compelled smaller states to prioritize their economic interest. As a result, states that practiced geoeconomics in the last decade are increasing the practice, and states who didn't now are forced to practice. The role of geoeconomics is also prevails because geoeconomics also helps states to address their economic security and at the same time allow states to balance the behavior of their powerhouses. Again, these states need cooperation, and it is not possible for them to battle and recover from this pandemic. For the regional cooperation and alliance-based politics, geoeconomics surely provides better opportunities than geopolitics at this time. As a result, in battling and recovering from corona outbreak, geoeconomics will surely have important and extended role in South Asian politics, where geopolitics will lose its authority, at least to some extent. Sino-Indian rivalry is also going to be geoeconomic in the long term due to the complex interdependence among them. For instance, till 2020, China was India's top trade partner. At present, though India took USA to take over the role, the trading volume between India and China is still very high, which is around 20 billion at present. Such interdependence compels states to address military conflicts in the short term. For instance, the Doklam crisis, which became short term, and Galwan Valley crisis, which also will be short term. India also projected geoeconomic reaction to the Galwan Valley crisis by banning apps and delaying Chinese products at the port. Such actions also influenced de-escalation, though the high altitude and harsh weather of Galwan is also not suitable for further escalation as this research projected. Again, banning apps is easy, but replacing and countering Chinese market leading products in Indian domestic market is not easy, and it requires time. As a result, complex nature of Sino-Indian rivalry places geopolitics relevant for short term and geoeconomics for long term. Other South Asian states also do not afford military power geopolitics in the long term. Thus, in the regional politics, geoeconomics prevails. To conclude, I would like to say that the corona effect on South Asian politics brings disaster to economies, both low income and middle income. To survive from this, the states require alliance building and regional cooperation. In this context, geoeconomics allows states to pursue their interest and create extra space between Sino-Indian rivalry. As a result, in the coming days, geoeconomics will surely be a huge factor in the South Asian politics and in foreign policy analysis of this region. Here is the bibliography of my research. And for any questions, queries, discussion, and further engagement on geoeconomics and South Asian politics, you can contact with the author. And here is my email address. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mufassir, for that excellent and expertly researched talk. We'll now be moving to our live Q&A very shortly, and we invite all those watching the YouTube live at the moment to follow the links that we've placed there to join us and let us know the questions that you have for all of our panel 3 participants. So we'll just give it a few minutes as the live YouTube comes to a close. Thank you.